Hello everybody. Welcome to my third installment of Judgment and Planning. This is International Master Mark Ginsburg, and today we're going to be looking at a line in the King's Indian from White's point of view. And the reason we're going to be doing this variation is because it's a way to sidestep Black's main ideas. Of course, in the King's Indian, Black usually tries to pawn storm White on the King's side and deliver mate. And so we can concoct a variation that sidesteps those means and put Black on his own resources. This usually leads to a good practical result. Let's see the first moves. We can start with c4 or d4. c4 has an advantage over d4 if you know they're going to play either a King's Indian or a Grunfeld, because after knight f6, knight c3, if they try to get into a Grunfeld with d5, we have an opportunity to get into a variation that you cannot get with d4. We delay d4 a little bit, and in this particular position we play queen to b3, hitting the knight. If the knight were to take, then queen takes causes problems for Black along the diagonal. He can't get his bishop fianchettoed. So that's not too nice. If he brings his knight back, we're then ready for d4, and after bishop g7, bishop f4, we develop this bishop outside the pawn chain. For example, castles, rook d1, and now we've shut off Black's main pawn break ideas, which are c5 and or e5 in certain positions. And so this position, White has sidestepped many of the dangerous Grunfeld variations, and he can develop normally with e3 coming up, etc. Just wanted to point that out because this move order with c4 gives White that extra option against the Grunfeld. Now, if Black were not to play d5, if he were to play g6, we can rule out the Grunfeld entirely with e4, and now d5 is definitely not possible. He has to go back to the King's Indian with d6, and now we quickly reel out the familiar first moves that have been seen in thousands of games, and we reach a King's Indian main line. We're going to diverge in a little bit, though. In this position, e5 is normal. We castle. Knight c6. White advances. Knight e7. And now the battle lines are drawn for a sharp confrontation. Normally, Black will play on the king's side with some pawn advance, trying to mate the white king. In this position, I think it's very interesting to try an unusual sideline of the bayonet. The bayonet attack starts with b4, and this has been seen in many games. Kramnik popularized it in the 90s, but I'm going to show you an unusual sideline that removes most of Black's attacking ideas. Knight h5 is the most common response, aiming for knight to f4. Let me show you something else. If Black plays a rather inferior move, which you will see in games though, an amateur level, knight d7, this is not a good move because White can initiate an action immediately with c5, sacking a pawn. It results in a structure where Black is going to be inferior in terms of pawn structure and on the defensive, not attacking at all. And that's what White wants. Suppose Black were to accept the pawn sacrifice with d takes c, we just take back. He has nothing better than to grab the pawn, and now we bring the bishop out with gain of time. And this position has been known for a long time to be pleasant for White. Going on a little bit, suppose he were to defend with b6, we rupture his pawns, and then we can continue in any number of ways. For example, we can just bring a rook to the open file. If he were to try to break out with f5, we line up the bishop for a possible discovered check. He gets out of the way, and after queen d3, we have a clamp on this position, and Black will find it very difficult to wiggle free. White's clearly better in this position. That's just an example variation showing the dangers of Black's knight d7 move. So returning to the initial position in the bayonet attack, Knight d7 is inferior because of this pawn sacrifice of c5. Good to know. Knight h5 is the main line, which you'll see most of the time. And now I recommend an unusual sideline that removes black's attacking ideas. The sideline is to advance immediately with c5. We're not going to worry about preventing knight f4. For example, in some variations, white plays g3, but it weakens, of course, the white squares, and the bishop can arrive on h3, and other unpleasantness happens to white's king later. We're not going to disturb white's kingside structure. We're going to play c5 and allow this. And now we're just going to remove it with gain of time. He takes back. We bring the rook to the open line. We've given up to two bishops, but the concession that black had to do is black had to bring a center pawn over to f4, and now these f pawns are, for the moment, doubled, and black can try to undouble them with f5, but that leads to openings against his own king on the white squares. So f5 advances are often dangerous. For example, if f5, it's even possible for white to bypass with e5, which leads to incredibly sharp positions, as follows. And then the queen can arrive at d5 with check after the knight moves. That's one way to play. Another way to play in this particular position is just to take on d6 immediately, and now after black takes back, we can offer an interesting gambit with bishop c4. Now we're threatening e5 against black's king. Let's say black accepted the pawn sacrifice with bishop c3, rook c3 takes. It's a very interesting position, but it turns out that white, in the last analysis, retains some advantage. Knight g5. Let's say bishop to f5, defending his pawn. Rook to e1, hitting the e-pawn again. Rook c8, for example. We get back the pawn with knight e4. And now in this particular position, white stands better because of the openness of black's king, basically. Black's king is not too happy having lost the fianchettoed bishop, and there are many more open squares in front of black's king, and whereas white's king is perfectly secure. So that's the nature of white's small advantage. Let's go back. The move f5, by the way, is hardly ever seen, but we had to mention it for completeness. So the move f5, we think that taking is a good answer, and then bishop to c4. So white played his rook to c1. One of the main ideas of this move is to clear the c file after cd, and then leap in with the knight to b5. The knight has no duty guarding e4 because nothing's attacking e4, so the knight has the opportunity to try to get to c7 via b5 after the c file opens up. Let's say black initiates his pawn storm with h6. White just makes room for his king. He clears the back rank, allowing black to connect his pawns. Optically nice for black. However, white is a little bit ahead in this position, and in this moment he can take, and after black takes back, we can proceed with knight b5, and after a6 we definitely want to go into c7, rook b8, because if the f-pawn ever left in later positions, oftentimes the knight can reach to e6. Another point is that the knight on c7 is extremely powerfully placed because it stops rook to e8, and it has that knight to e6 option in certain positions, as we just saw. So let's see what could happen. We want to play b5 with the idea of cementing the knight on c7 with b6. We could prepare b5 additionally with a4 and then b5, but the immediate b5 is strong because after ab, we don't waste time taking that weak pawn back. We just get the queen out here to b3, again lining up potentially against black's king in the event of any further pawn advances on black's part. So we have this queen to b3 move. Black defends his weak pawn at least a little bit. We ignore that very instructively with rook c2. These are all strong moves. And after black attacks the knight, again, we refuse to gain a weak pawn. We just build up protecting the knight. And black's cramped and stands worse here because all of white's pieces are working, and any kind of f5 break is always met with the bypassing e5. So it's very difficult, and after rook fc1, it's very difficult for black to find a constructive move, and white stands clearly better. Notice how black's main King's Indian ideas are not happening in this game. We don't have a concentrated attack on white's king. We don't have danger of checkmate hovering around white's king. Instead, we have white demonstrating superior activity with better mobility and placement of his pieces. A welcome change from most King's Indians where white has to labor under defense. So that was an interesting line where we just put the knight on c7 and supported it. In a game I played, I didn't appreciate that variation well enough. And in the game I played, which is still instructive, I played a4 because I figured I could always take later. However, taking immediately, as we just saw, was the most accurate. Nevertheless, the rest of the game is instructive because it features this knight dancing all over the board looking for squares. Black puts his knight to g6. It looks sensible, but white still has time for takes, and as you might have guessed, knight to b5. And after a6, as you know, we come in to c7. He must move his rook, and we have the programmed b5 with the idea of cementing the white knight. White's clearly better here as well. Takes, queen e7. And now we can ignore the threat to the pawn, interestingly, and I did ignore. I played rook to e1. You can examine the position a little bit and see that if he were to take it, we have bishop to c4 uncovering an attack on the queen. It has to go to the strange square f5. We continue bothering the queen. The white knight is doing a good duty guarding d5, so he has to go back to f6. And we have the knight pirouette knight e8, which is very pleasant. Queen's hit again. It must go back to d8. We can eliminate black's defensive bishop. And now it's just angle to put the white queen onto the long diagonal, bothering black. Black has 6 pawns, and we only have 5, but it turns out that black has extreme difficulty organizing his pieces. So white has excellent compensation. Continuing a little bit, if he were to develop the bishop, we just put the queen out where it attacks the sensitive pawn. If he were to guard the pawn, let's look a moment. He stopped my idea of queen to d4 check for the time being. We don't want to trade queens. But do you see another move for white? After queen b6? It turns out this position is great for white. I'll just give you a moment to take a look. What is the nature of the advantage? The nature of the advantage is that it's white's turn to move, and he has the opportunity to get to black's king. How to get to black's king? Well, we should try to break up the pawn formation in front of the king. That indicates to us that h4 is the right move. It's very strong. We played h3 earlier in the game, but you should never have preconceptions and always be alert to the fact that the pawns can move again. And in this case, h4 is very strong. Black has no good answer to the primitive threat of hg. Let's take a look. Suppose he were to bypass with g4. This move meets with ruination after h5, and white is too fast. For example, gf, hg, fg. On the surface, it looks like black is holding, because after rook check, he can put the rook in the way. But it actually doesn't hold, because we just double the rooks, and now we're threatening all sorts of nastiness with rook f7 and queen f4, so black guards his rook with his other rook, And now we can deliver a crushing blow. Do you see it? It utilizes a motif. Queen c3 check or queen b2 check would have been just as good. He can't put his king back to g8 because the g6 pawn is hanging to the bishop, so he has to put his king to h7. And now he meets an untimely demise because we pop into f6 with the queen, exploiting a pin. Rook takes queen is illegal. And so after queen f6, very unfortunately for black, the g6 pawn is hanging. The rook is hanging. Too many things are hanging, and black is checkmated. A very nice conclusion where black's king was smoked out with just a few simple moves. It's very funny how black, let me go back a little bit, it's very funny how the king just melted down after a modest probe of the pawn structure. h4 happened, and black immediately had difficulty holding the position. Is there anything else for him to do? Let's take a look. What can you do after h4? It's a very difficult position to hold. If he were to take on h4, that actually is very bad. We take, and now if he takes with the pawn, we're going to come in with the rook to e7. That's going to win. And if he takes with the king, that looks ridiculous, of course. And we can kill the king with the action of the queen and knight. Knight h4 check. Let's say he came up to g5. I know it's looking ridiculous, but we have to just see it. We can just put the knight back to f3. And after king g6, rook e7, just too much is happening and black is lost. So it's kind of a misleading position because you might think black was okay after queen b6, but in fact h4 is just too much to handle. It proves the correctness of white's pawn sacrifice in this variation. In the game he didn't take on e4. Maybe he saw this, or maybe just on general principle he thought it was too risky. He's correct. He played b6 to stop white from solidifying the knight. Knight to a6 was played with the idea of rerouting the knight to b4. Notice that the knight's always finding a nice home. He comes into b7. Knight to d4, I'm aiming at various squares. Takes, at least he got rid of one of my dangerous knights. And he put his knight on a nice square. But, as you can see, I play knight to b4, and my knight on c6 will challenge his best piece. Queen f6, knight c3, knight c6, knight e5, knight c6. The reason I do that is because he was threatening knight f3 check, if you look. He was threatening knight f3 check and then winning my queen. The advantage of this knight c6 move is I protect my queen against that threat. He takes the opportunity to break up my king side, but after bishop takes, knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes, it turns out that white's pieces are much more active than black's, and so white has a decisive advantage here. Just kick the queen with rook c3, queen f4, bring the king up, just in case, to guard the h-pawn additionally. It's very pleasant for white because white has such a strong natural attack in this position. Black desperately tries to shut off avenues for white. Rook f3, queen h4, at least staying on the h-pawn a little bit. I give additional defense to the h3 point before considering trying to take any material. Black desperately tries to make counterplay with g4. White takes, bishop takes, rook g3, black unpins. He's doing the best he can because both sides are somewhat low on time. The moment is right for e5 because white is now attacking the bishop laterally, and discovered checks don't work because the white queen again is protected by the knight. So if we go back, e5 is the correct move. The bishop is attacked. Black sets up some interesting counter checks with rook g7. It's not quite over yet because he can organize a counterattack at the very last moment as follows. I took on d6. He played queen to h5. I gave a check. He brought his king back. This is not important to the theory of the opening, but it is a nice tactical finish. I played my knight to e7. f5, I naturally blockade that pawn. But he takes the moment to play rook a8, and suddenly, in mutual time trouble, this looks kind of scary because the rook is threatening to come down here. Also, black has notions of bishop to h3 check because the rook is pinning my rook. So if you look at it, black is getting some kind of counterplay maybe. In time trouble it's not so easy. What I should have played here is a very nice continuation. I should have played d7 because what I didn't understand is that, well, I didn't understand a couple of things. It's kind of a funny variation. First of all, if he were to check, I can just get out of the way with king to h2, and I can block any further bishop discoveries with the simple rook to h3. That's the first thing I didn't see. The second thing I didn't really understand was after rook a1, queen, it looks optically like black's king is completely safe, and black has the scary queen h1 mate happening, but the computer unkindly points out that the counter-sacrifice queen f5 is decisive. It removes all the mate threats, and if black were to take with the bishop, we have a forced mate with rook takes, king takes, queen g8, king f6 is forced, queen f8, queen f7, and now the nice knight g8 check, king up, queen takes, king up, mate. So that counter-sacrifice is something I didn't really see in time trouble. We're going to go back to the position where I didn't see the value of d7. So in this position I was a little bit worried, and I dropped back to defend. And he played the sacrifice rook a4, which is a great move. This is move 39. The time control is move 40. And of course, if I were to make a mistake and take his rook, it would be embarrassing because after bishop f3 check, my rook is pinned. And I have to go back with my king, but then he has this checkmate. Queen h1, rook back, and I mated. That would be unpleasant. So, I have very little time left. He's just played this rook a4 move. My queen's attacked. I can't take it because of that mate. So what do I do? Well, it turns out there's only one way to win at this point. Playing d7 to make a queen won't win because he can just take my queen off, and after I make a new queen, his king has shelter and I have no checks. Well, I really set myself a dilemma here, but fortunately I was able to see the answer. The answer is actually sacrificing a rook with rook h1. This is, by this point, the only way to win. This shuts down his mate threats. He does win a rook with queen takes h1, king takes, rook takes f4, d7. He is a rook ahead, but I'm making a new queen. He gives a check. Now, if I made the mistake of taking it, he would be mating me. That would be very embarrassing. But fortunately, I have the king move, and then he again threatens mate. But this is his last gasp. And now I'm able to make a queen with check. And unfortunately, this rook takes g7 is check again. and then I have the knight f5 check, and the fact that it's check means he has no time to deliver his mate, and then his rook is falling, so black resigned at this point. So white was able to save the game with that last tactic. Let me go back to the beginning of the game to show you the basic principles one more time. We learned that getting into a Grunfeld would be pleasant for white given the c4 move on move 1. That's a nice sideline to know. And we also learned here that the bayonet attack is surprisingly dangerous if we play the immediate c5. The main idea is to take on d6, black takes back, and we bring the knight to c7, supported by at least the b pawn and maybe the a pawn to cement it on c7. The purpose of that maneuver is to anticipate black's natural break of f5, because that's only going to open up lines to black's own king. In most positions, black plays h6 in most games, and after h3, g5, we reach the game that we just discussed, where white was a little bit faster on the queen side, and these pawns, although they look nice, as we saw in the game, white has a chance to break them up in certain positions and gain attack, and otherwise they don't represent a crippling pawn storm that will checkmate white. In fact, they're kind of static there, and white's remaining pieces, surprisingly, white can work efficiently without a opposing bishop, because this knight is very dangerous to get to c7. All of white's other pieces have freedom to move, so you can think of this bishop f4 capture as a clearance. It cleared us to work on the c-file very fast. So this very sharp position, I recommend you take a look at it because it's very instructive. In fact, in this particular position, as we saw, this move immediately is good. It's a nice position for white, so I think you should take a look. It represents a throwback to the very beginnings of white's treatments against the King's Indian. This is the bayonet attack old way of handling it, and it merits a re-examination. If you're prepared in this kind of line, black is likely not to be, because it's not in fashion. So you'll be able to play your moves without searching too hard, because they're not difficult or counterintuitive moves, and black's regular plans of just attacking you willy-nilly are not going to happen here. White's king is completely secure, and it's going to be a positional battle, and white has good chances because black's ordinary plans of opening the game up often backfire horribly because the knight is so mobile. So that's it for this session. I hope you enjoyed it. Why don't you give it a try and comment to me on chess.com if you had an interesting game with it, and we can set up a forum discussion blog and talk about it. So thanks a lot. Thanks for listening, and talk to you next time.